everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. I am Brady, also known as the War Hamster. Joining me today is my good friend, constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V Gibbs.
Thanks for having me.
And I really do like that bookshelf look. You got to go with that more often. Yeah, green screens were great when they came out, but I think the natural is kind of taken over. Natural background. Today, Doug is back from a long series of travels to see all kinds of neat things around the country, historical, constitutional era sites.
Got my Jamestown shirt on, as a matter of fact.
Very good. Fortunately, he was unable to make it up here to historical Portsmouth, but we'll remedy that soon enough.
We'll definitely got to do that, definitely.
Yeah. Especially because we're going to talk a little bit about pirates today. So a lot of the pirates came from here. Subject today, this is going to be part 2 of our series going through Madison's notes from the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. First episode, we talked about why they decided to convene and needed to, at the time, they were looking to amend the Articles of Confederation. And the real issue was the Articles of Confederation were put together. They were so worried about centralized tyrannical government that they created almost no central government at all. So when things like Shays' Rebellion occurred, that Congress had no power to do anything to maintain order. And that was the driving force, that and some economic reasons to originally amend the Articles of Confederation. And as you'll see as we go through this, they quickly decided we're going to have to rewrite the whole thing. But they didn't want anyone to know that. But before we jump in, we have something going on very similar to Shays' Rebellion right now in Los Angeles, as we've got riots trying to interfere with ICE agents doing their constitutional duty to enforce the border. President Donald Trump has now called up the National Guard and the Marines. And the constitutional question I'm going to ask for Doug is, does Trump have the constitutional authority to do what he just did?
And so first of all, let's talk about the obvious part. The National Guard was originally brought in to protect federal buildings. Federal buildings are federal property, and the federal government, President of the United States, would have every right to deploy those personnel to those buildings, to that region to protect federal property. Now the question is, okay, but can these troops, National Guard, Marine Corps, be used beyond just those federal buildings? And we've got a few places. Now, the first one doesn't really apply yet because California isn't asking for help. But Article 4, Section 4 states that the United States shall guarantee to every state, this is from the Constitution, in this union, a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and I'll get to that, and on application of the legislature or of the executive act of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So now the question is this just domestic violence? If it is, then the federal government needs to wait until California, the executive, if the legislature can't convene, or the legislature says, hey, we need help, bring in the troops. Here's now where it gets interesting when it comes to this clause. This is, in my opinion, not just domestic violence. The actors that are participating are waving Mexican flags. The majority of them, I believe, to be illegal aliens, foreign actors, and and God knows who is really involved. We believe that there's even foreign funding behind it. Would that not constitute an invasion force? In other words, an invasion force that has come into this country that is now waging violence in one of our cities. If that is the case, and it is invasion, then the federal government doesn't need the requests for help by the state because it is an invasion situation. Then when it comes to the National Guard would be labeled as a militia. This is according to the Dick Act. I want to say 1902. It's 1902-93 1903, right around there. I'm thinking 1902. And what that act did was it made it changed our U.S. code to identify the National Guard as being a part of the militia. If it is a part of the militia, the definition of the militia is that, first of all, it's not a military force, so habeas corpus doesn't necessarily apply. And habeas corpus. Why am I saying habeas corpus? And I'm blanking on the law from the late 1800s that posse comitatus. That's what it is. Posse comitatus would not apply because that's towards the military, and this National Guard as a militia belongs to the states first, but the federal government can call them up for federal service. Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union. So once again, we don't need permission from the state. Executing immigration law in this case, suppress insurrections and repel invasions. 2 out of those, maybe all 3, apply. Once again, federal government doesn't need to get permission in that case because they are trying to execute the laws of the Union. Now, the protesters are saying, well, gosh, we're a sanctuary state. States' rights. You can't get involved. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting argument. I'm all about states' rights. I love states' rights. I believe that the states have a right over the issues that they are authorized over to take care of their own business. The federal government has no business being a state for those issues, except this is not one of those issues. Immigration is authorized by the Constitution, naturalization, Article 1, Section 8, migration in Article 1, Section 9, to the federal government. So federal law is what has to be legislated regarding immigration. And if the federal government has that authority, then that means the states don't. 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment says that if something is provided as a power to the federal government, then the states don't have that authority. If it's not provided to the federal government and it's not prohibited to states, then it's a state issue. Well, it is provided to the government as an authority. Immigration is. And Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 9. And so immigration law is federal law, and they're trying to execute that law in that state. And the sanctuary state laws, sanctuary city laws, all of that is in violation then of Article 6. Article 6 says that the Constitution and laws made pursuant of the Constitution, in this case, immigration law being a federal authority, is the supreme law of the land, and states any state law to the contrary notwithstanding. In other words, is null and void. So, yes, the immigration law authority belongs to the federal government. Yes, they can enforce it. And no, the state cannot interfere in the way that they are. And yes, if necessary to execute that law and to repel invasion, the National Guard can be brought in. Now we ask ourselves, can the military be brought in? As I mentioned earlier, posse comitatus. Well, that's a law. While the laws are important, is it a constitutional law restricting the military from being used on domestic turf? The Founding Fathers were definitely afraid of standing armies being used against the people on domestic soil. That's the whole reason behind posse comitatus in the late 1800s. So can military be used? There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the federal government cannot use them. It's always been an understanding that the military is for external and the militias are for internal. But if necessary, the federal government can bring in also military personnel. And there are examples of it during Washington's presidency of military personnel and militiamen being used together. And one of them would be the Whiskey Rebellion. So there's my very long 2 cents.
Not very good. I think it's really important we hit that topic. Not only is it important to Madison's notes, because it's one of the major reasons we created the executive branch of government in the first place.
Well, Shays' Rebellion was definitely one of the reasons behind this type of violence, because the federal government couldn't do anything about it. The whole point of this Constitutional Convention was because this kind of violence was going on, and the government under the Articles of Confederation was too weak to do anything about it. We need the government to do things about this kind of violence.
Yeah, just to recap, everyone, Shays' Rebellion happened in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts state government under the Boston Brahmins, some of my favorite people, had created a pretty unequal economic situation, and the taxes and debts from the Revolutionary War were causing all kinds of economic strife, and the veterans of the Revolutionary War weren't having it. They didn't fight to live under a different kind of tyranny. So that's where we're coming from. So Virginia gathers everyone together, says we need to amend these Articles of Confederation. They are not strong enough. Everyone was aware of that. That's why they were meeting. The one state that did not show up was Rhode Island. Talked about last time, Rhode Island's always been a bit of a pest. One of the things that we'll get into in Madison's notes is one of the big decisions they'll make is what is the process for amending the Constitution or the Articles of Amendment. The way the Articles of Confederation wrote it, you needed all 13 colonies to make a change. And there's Rhode Island always out there saying, nah, we're not going to do it. So nothing could ever get done. The new U.S. Constitution went down to a 2/3 to propose and 3/4 to ratify, which is still pretty darn hard to change the ruling document. But
and for those who want to argue, well, then that means the Articles of Confederation being gotten rid of was illegal because Rhode Island wasn't there. No, but they did eventually ratify the Constitution. It was 100% ratification ultimately to replace the Articles of Confederation. So that argument doesn't say that they can't meet, that 100% is required to meet. It's 100% required to ratify a change, and they did.
Very good. Before we jump into Madison's notes, I wanted to read a quick little blurb from Hillsdale College's imprimis. I get it mailed out to me every month. This is the May 2025 version. They have some really good articles, some good historians there. Real quickly, if you want to know a little bit more about the history of things like the calling up the troops and everything, there's a video on my channel that Doug and I did a while back about the history of the militia, the history of the militia acts, plural, because there were several of them. We also did a recent video on the history of American tariffs. We did that in the lieu of Trump's tariff fights. That being said, this article is called Tariffs in American History. Need a little more light here, so hang on. There we go. It says tariffs are among the oldest taxes for the simple reason that they are easy to collect. Just send in the tax collectors and don't let the goods being transported move until the duty has been paid. Being one of the earliest forms of taxation, it is not surprising that tariffs produce one of the earliest forms of tax evasion, smuggling. In America's colonial period, the east coast of the United States, with its many rivers and inlets and the small ships of those days could utilize, lent itself to smuggling, and the American colonists evaded British tariffs on a grand scale. Our founding fathers were pirates, a lot of them. In fact, a lot of the founding fortunes of American history came from the slave trade, the opium trade, the sugar triangle trade. Indeed, Rhode Island, with its long coastline relative to the area and its many small harbors, was the epicenter of colonial smuggling, and it opposed any attempts to suppress it. Rhode Island was the first colony to forswear allegiance to Great Britain on May 4th, 1776, 2 months before the Declaration of Independence. It was also the only state not to send delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, fearing that a stronger federal government, empowered to tax, would suppress smuggling. And it was the last state to ratify the Constitution on May 29, 1790, more than a year after the federal government had come into existence. It did so then only under the threat of having its exports taxed as if from a foreign nation. That's probably enough of that to kind of sets the stage.
Now, for my own purposes and the purpose of the audience, now, what you were reading there, is that a book or is that a link?
Imprimis is.
Oh, that's right. Imprimis.
Yeah, it's just a flyer. It's a little small newsletter they send out every month.
I used to get it and I stopped getting it, and so I need to.
They have an online subscription too, but something I like to read at the dinner table.
Yeah,
but it's good stuff.
If now, and actually, while you're reading, I went to Hillsdale College, and I put myself on the Imprimis list again. For some reason, I don't get it anymore. If I don't get the May version, I want a copy of that. I want you to take a picture of it or copy it on a machine or something, because that was interesting.
Yeah,
and I encourage all of you to get Imprimis. It's definitely, so I've got a bunch of them. I used to, like I said, receive them, and over the last year, for some reason, maybe because I moved out of state.
It's fun every once in a while to have an article that tells a little bit more of the establishment version of history than we favor. That's
right.
We prefer the accurate one. I like that. We could break some of those down in the future. That'd be good. All right, jumping into Madison's notes. James Madison is the only person allowed to take notes at the convention, or take them, or have his notes leave the building. Everything.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't the only one taking notes. Trust me, there was a lot of them that were. Lyons was, Robert Yates was before he left after 6 weeks. But Madison's Madison was not only the one, aside from the secretary, was the only one taking notes. Secretary was as well. But Madison's was the best. That said, Madison did not think his was the best. He actually did refer to all the other notes after he was done, and then made some minor changes to supplement his notes afterwards. Anyway, continue.
And it brings up an interesting question. If we had a convention of states today, a lot of people are worried about a runaway convention, what have you, and we won't get into that. But the question is, would a modern day convention be allowed to be held in secret? And I would suggest that full transparency is absolutely required.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Okay, very good. So the first episode of this series, we talked about, the first several weeks of the convention was just figuring out the rules of the convention. Basically, they put something really similar to Robert's Rules of Order in place. So this is how we're going to do the convention. So you're going to want to watch that first, because you'll understand the notes as they go. There's a lot of procedural questions you'll see in here. So
yeah, and we will, and as you watch and see what went on, the procedure was very, very similar to what today is Robert's Rules of Orders. These are age-old delegation rules.
Okay, so jumping in, we are going to the Avalon Project from Yale University, and when we left off, Mr. Randolph from Virginia is getting ready to speak. They've already passed the rules and regulations. Mr. Randolph is speaking because he's a delegate from Virginia. Virginia is the state that called for the convention. They are presenting their plan first, also known as the Virginia Plan. Mr. Randolph then opened the main business. He expressed his regret that it should fall to him, rather than those who were longer standing in life and political experience, to open the great subject of their mission.
Let's stop there for a second. Now, let's understand the history of these guys and the way they saw things. They recognized the importance of people who had time in the place when it came to the basically the skill of the science of politics. And this, in their minds, was kind of a pseudo aristocracy. Those who've been around for a while, been in the system, and had a long-standing and political in life and political experience, were to be revered, be appreciated, and hold higher positions, because it's kind of an aristocracy kind of thinking, where those who've been around for a while and involved for a long time were typically going to be wiser in those things. This is one of the reasons why they structured, I won't get into it yet, but structured part of our government the way they did, is they recognized that was one of the advantages of aristocracy was that you had people who had long-standing in life and political experience, were skilled in the science of politics. All right, go ahead.
I like the humility with which he opened it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But once again, he's recognizing, hey, I don't even have the kind of experience some of these guys have, but let's do this anyway. Go ahead.
But as the convention had originated from Virginia and his colleagues supposed that some proposition was expected from them, they had imposed this task upon him, or on him. He then commented on the difficulty of the crisis and the necessity of preventing the fulfillment of the prophecies of the American downfall.
Now, those prophecies all over Europe. This is not going to work. You're in a world of empires. You're a developing country, and you're not going to have a centralized, wise leader. You're going to consent to the what kind of crazy talk is that?
Not to mention that several of those European powers would have been very happy to take advantage of a weak United States and get some more territory for themselves.
Exactly.
But this American experiment was predicted to fail. And
absolutely.
These people were
and that continued belief continued well into the 19th century. One of my favorite quotes by Sigmund Freud, when asked about America, he says, "America is huge. What I mean by that is it is a huge mistake." But anyway, continue.
All right. He observed that in revising you notice something about this the spelling. There's a lot of things that look like they're spelled wrong. I believe Avalon Project transcribed it straight from his notes.
Yes.
So there are some interesting spellings back then. He observed that in revising the federal system, we ought to inquire, 1, into the properties which such a government ought to possess, 2, the defects of the Confederation, 3, the dangers of our situation, and 4, the remedy.
Now, remember, at this point, everybody is, whether they believed it to be true or not, is beside the point. We're there to fix the Articles of Confederation. The writing of a new constitution, while uttered in murmurs, was not out there yet.
No, there might have been riots had it been.
People... Exactly. Well, people, when it finally became apparent after 5 or 6 weeks that they were going to write a new constitution, a bunch of the delegates walked out. Robert Yates and John Lansing from New York being a couple of them.
He actually makes this really clear, because the key word here is revising the federal system.
Mm-hmm.
He talks, so continuing. The character of such a government ought to secure against foreign invasion, against dissensions between members of the Union or seditions in particular states. Sound familiar? To procure to the several states various blessings of which an isolated situation was incapable. 4, in other
words, the benefit of being in a union.
Yes. 4, to be able to defend itself against encroachment. And 5, to be paramount to the state constitutions. Now
recognize state constitutions for most of the states already existed. Now, there were some states like Connecticut that were still operating under other documents. Connecticut was still under the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. They didn't get their first constitution until 1818. But state constitutions were important. They hadn't written a national constitution. I hate to use the word national, but that's the word that came to mind. But they did have state constitutions.
Federal. We can call it a federal constitution. That was intended to be. And they use the words paramount, and that's important because this is where the supremacy clause first enters into our world. This is a big debate. Does federal government supersede state powers? And that's where the enumeration doctrine comes in. And they're going to debate this. But paramount means superior to all others, eminent, of the highest order. So what he's saying there is that this document needs to be written that it is paramount to the state constitutions.
Now we and this is an interesting point, because it sounds like, well, no, these guys want a big giant centralized government. Well, at that time, most of them, yes. If you read John Taylor of Caroline, his book A New View of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1823, in chapter 1, he explains that nearly all of the delegates that walked into that convention were nationalists. In other words, they believed in a big, solid, overpowering, centralized central government. And so the way I like to explain it is, could you imagine those who believe in big government today getting together in a convention saying, hey, we're going to write you guys a new constitution. Don't worry about it. There would be riots. And these guys were in secrecy partly for that reason. But what's interesting as we go through these notes, and James Madison, I think, is the most glaring example, is while most of them went in with this nationalist, big government, big central government mindset, most of them came out very different men, looking at America as requiring a limited government, that the state's sovereignty was more important to them coming out than it was going in, that those state constitutions were very important. So it's an interesting metamorphosis to watch.
And that's really emphasizes how reasonable people having rational debate can come to the right conclusions. And that's what they're here to do. This is what a convention is supposed to, that is what's supposed to occur. Level heads. You don't go in there with your mind made up. You debate honestly and openly, and you sometimes come to better decisions. 2, in speaking of the defects of the Confederation, he professed a high respect for its authors and considered them as having done all that patriots could do in the then infancy of the science of constitutions and confederacies.
Now, why the infancy of constitutions? There'd really never been a written constitution. Ours is the first written constitution in history. There are written documents that would contribute to the ideas of constitutions, or could be considered sort of like constitutions. The 10 tables of law, in Rome, the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Rights, those are all very important documents, but none of them are constitutions. Constitutions were known, like English common law. It was known but not written. So when people, like when Samuel Adams, prior at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, referred to the British Constitution, it wasn't a written document. It was something that everybody understood, and it was contributed to by things like the English Declaration of Rights, and judicial decisions and case law and Magna Carta and things like that. But no country had ever actually written a constitution. So when he says the infancy of the science of constitutions and of confederacies, what he's saying is we're doing something no one's ever done, and it is in its infancy. We have started something in its infancy, and so this is a path that nobody's taken before. He's admitting right there, this is something new on the horizon. It has never been tried before in this manner.
And he also finishes the sentence with, and of confederacies. Just to hammer home a point Doug and I have been making for years. This is intended to be a confederacy. It was not intended to be a national government.
Confederacy. And also he's wanting to remind everybody, no, really, we're here to fix the Articles of Confederation, even though a lot of them knew that wasn't going to happen.
All right. When the inefficiency of requisitions was unknown, no commercial discord had arisen among many states. No rebellion had appeared, as in Massachusetts, Shays Rebellion.
Yeah, don't you love the abbreviation? Sort of like Philadelphia on the Liberty Bell. The abbreviations cracked me up. Anyway, go ahead.
Foreign debts had not become urgent. The havoc of paper money had not been foreseen. Treaties had not been violated, and perhaps nothing better could be obtained from the jealousy of the states with regard to their sovereignty. So he's basically saying when he wrote the Articles of Confederation, we didn't know what we didn't know. Now that we've seen it, we got to fix it.
Now, and the funny thing is the havoc of paper money. Historically, everybody knew that paper money created havoc, but they did it anyway. And then they act shocked. Wow, that went south really fast. Yeah, I can see you laughing. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we'll get into paper money later in this series, because they do have a bit of a debate over having a national bank or not. And we know who wanted that, and we know he lost. All right. So he then proceeds to enumerate the defects of the Articles of Confederation. Number one.
Now, mind you, what does this remind you of, folks? Sort of maybe like the Declaration of Independence. This is, in a sense, the list of grievances. All right, continue, please.
That the Confederation, but again, it's grievances against, he's basically singing the praises of the people who created it. Says, we didn't know, but all right, now we do.
But here's our list of problems. If we're going to have a solution, we need to know what the problem is. Declaration did the same thing. Go ahead.
That the Confederation produced no security against foreign invasion. It's a big one.
Yeah, that's a bit. In other words, the ability to create a standing army for the Union to fight against invasion.
Congress not being permitted to prevent a war nor to support it by their own authority.
In other words, the inability to tax to fund that effort.
Yeah, you can want to, if you really want to get deep into this, Doug and I did I think a 3 or 4 volume series on the Articles of Confederation, and we talked about that in more detail. Of this, he cited many examples, most of which he tended to shew, I think he means show, that they could not cause infractions of the treaties of laws of nations to be punished.
What good is holding up the law if you can't, have a penalty and enforce that penalty for violating some?
Yeah, no, they have no authority, no power. The particular states might, by their conduct, provoke war without control. And that comes down to having the executive branch or the federal government be able to handle international affairs. They did not want states doing their own treaties, and that was happening, and that was going to be a problem.
That's also, you got to remember that the states bickered with each other like siblings. There's also that, and it's funny because when I mention the militias, and I tell people that one of the reasons for the militias is also to protect the states from each other, and people are kind of shocked when I say that. Remember, they bickered like siblings. They fought over everything, and so they want to provoke. So the provoking war would not only be with other nations, but with each other. Continue.
And that neither militia nor drafts being fit for defense on such occasions. Enlistments, spelled with an I, only could be successful, and these could not be executed without money. That's their argument for a standing army. Okay, which they did not have.
Right.
So
and they had the Continental Army, the regulars, during the war, but that essentially was disbanded after the war.
Well, it had to
back
be.
to militias.
They had no ability to pay them, which is also one of the reasons we got Shays' Rebellion.
Right.
Okay. 2.
Well, they were giving them property, but you can only give away land for so long. So we go ahead.
That the federal government could not check the quarrels between the states, nor a rebellion in any way, not having constitutional power nor means to interpose according to the exigency.
Yeah, so once again, number one, you not only have the perils of disagreements within the Union, but what about interstate disputes is what they're talking about, and Commerce Clause being one of the things that tries to help with that. Go ahead.
This next one's a really important one. That there were many advantages which the U.S. might acquire, which were not attainable under the Confederation, such as a productive impost, counteraction of the commercial regulations of other nations pushing of commerce and ad libitum.
In other words, tariffs.
Protective tariffs, more specifically, because there is a difference. That was a problem. Who were our trading partners? The European powers, and they, had hundreds of years of experience in maritime trade, and they wanted to protect their businesses and make our goods reduce our ability to export our own goods.
While they were practicing mercantilism, we had no way to defend against it. And the protective tariffs, I don't like that term for it because the leftists made the word protectionism such a bad word. But tariffs generally are good for a country's sovereignty and for protecting their manufacturing. When it comes to economies, the founding fathers understood the importance of the supply side of economics, the manufacturing side. If you're not manufacturing, if you're not producing, then you're on the wrong side of a trade deficit.
Number 4, that the federal government could not defend itself against encroachments from the states. States had militias. Government did not.
Mm-hmm. And if the federal government needed to use those militias, the states would be like, well, I don't know. I don't know if we should send our people. Figure out another way.
Yeah, I mean, just because the Indians are invading in New York doesn't mean we have to send our South Carolinians up to join them.
Exactly.
That it was not even paramount to the state constitutions ratified as it was in should be many of the states. Basically complaining that the Articles of Confederation are an inferior document to the state constitutions. And we'll review some of these early state constitutions because there's some beautiful things in there. And
yeah,
the Virginia Constitution in particular, I think, is just an absolute work of art. A lot of the language we have in the U.S. Constitution are picked just straight from there verbatim.
You got to understand that confederacies, by their own nature, leaves almost all the power to the member states. The central governing body has essentially very little or no power. We used to be able to say that about the European Union, in the very beginning. Not so much now. Brussels has all kinds of power, but typically in confederacies, the central power has almost no power. The member states hold all the power, and they can act independently pretty much at will. And that's what was one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, the EU is doomed to fail from the beginning. You cannot have a monetary union without a political union, and they found that out the hard way.
Mm-hmm.
All right, he next reviewed the danger of our situation, appealed to the sense of the best friends of the United States, the prospect of anarchy from the laxity of government everywhere. And that's no exaggeration, because we were getting pretty close to anarchy and having 13 individual states, some of them warring against each other.
Especially in Boston. But Boston was always known to be a rough town, so, you know.
Boston Brahmins again. I've been going off in the Boston Brahmins and our other series on the Skull and Bones and the history of secret societies I do with Colonel Tanner Watkins. So I've been reading up on the Boston Brahmins, and they're a fun bunch.
Yeah.
All right, he is proposed as comfortable.
You think the gangs of New York were rough, but anyway, go ahead.
He proposed as comfortable to his ideas the following resolutions, which he explained one by one. Here insert ye resolutions annexed. Okay, here are the resolutions. There's different variants on these. I'm just going to read straight from the one that the Avalon has here. But if you're going through this, variants A, B, and C, there's some slightly different versions of this set of resolutions.
C is the one inserted by the Avalon Project. Okay. But it's good that they give us those options, just a few of the others if we choose to.
Yep. I actually read them all, and the differences aren't enough for us to go through. They do say the same thing. Resolved that the Articles of Confederation ought to be so corrected and enlarged as to accomplish the objects proposed by their institution, namely common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare.
General welfare is a general condition of all's well. That's all it is.
Thank you. Oh, you mean it doesn't mean the federal government has to make sure to provide health care to every single human being, whether they're a citizen or not?
Well, as I was pointing out to my wife last night while I was watching vehicles burn in L.A., and the arguments of those when it comes to immigration, and I know they broke the law, but the common good of this and the common good of that. And what happens is the common good, the general welfare, then takes precedent over the rule of law. And if you keep doing that, what's going to happen is respect for the rule of law decreases, which is what we're seeing. When you put general welfare above the rule of law loses its strength and its respect.
And that right there is a microcosm of the argument of democracy versus a Republican form of government right there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And by the way, I was told reliably by CNN that those LA gatherings were peaceful. So I'm not sure what you're talking about with the violence, but
yeah, we have I'm trying to remember her name too. There's a California representative, as on CNN, they're showing the fires and stuff.
Yeah.
She's like, no, they're peaceful. I don't know what they're talking about.
I mean, it's all the same thing, same stuff with the George Floyd riots. And it's worth mentioning. Artificial intelligence is so advanced right now; they can make videos that look 100% lifelike. I personally think we're going to have to make some kind of an international law that any CGI has to have some kind of disclaimer that this is computer generated. Because how do we know that the videos we're watching on the news aren't totally fabricated? How do we?
Right.
You can't believe your lying eyes anymore.
Yeah.
All right, 2. Resolved, therefore, that the rights of suffrage of the national legislature ought to be proportioned to the quotas of contribution, or to the number of free inhabitants, as the one or the other rule may seem best in different cases.
Rights of suffrage is representation, and the complaint here is that in the Congress at this time under the Confederation, while a state can have many delegates, in the end, every state only has one vote. The argument here is basically the Virginia Plan argument, which is, hey, if we have a larger population, if we have more contributors, more inhabitants, we should have a larger voice. Now, the more heavily populated states think that's a great idea. The less populated states, not so much. But we'll get into that down the road.
Yeah, we will definitely get into that. But he uses an interesting term here called quotas of contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not something we see in the everyday lexicon, so I decided to look it up.
Okay.
And here's what I got from Grok.
Okay.
The term quotas of contribution most likely refers to historical systems where states or colonies were required to provide specific resources, funds, or manpower to a central authority, often during times of war or colonial governance.
Well, and if you have a larger population, you're going to be contributing more personnel.
Yeah. There was during the colonial period.
It's kind of the idea of, well, we're doing more work. Shouldn't we have more say?
Pre-Revolutionary War, the British Crown often requested or mandated that American colonies contribute resources for imperial wars, such as French and Indian War. Each colony was assigned a quota of troops, funds, or supplies based on its population, wealth, or economic capacity. So that's what he's talking about there.
Mm-hmm.
Resolved that the national legislature ought to consist of 2 branches.
This historically has been shown to be successful. Under the Confederation, there's a single branch Congress. Historically, Roman Republic, Greece, the British, two houses of different types of persons, so that you have 2 different ways of looking at things. That was the idea. In Rome, the assembly was the people, and the Senate were the wealthy and the powerful. In Britain, you have the House of Commons, the people, and the House of Lords, the nobility, the wealthy and powerful. This idea of, that way, just one house with just one voice isn't just doing everything. It creates a natural check. What's fascinating is with the 17th Amendment, we have made both houses pretty much exactly the same. We might as well have gone back to the single legislature.
Indeed. Of course, we don't have local representation anymore. We have representation that owes their allegiance to one of 1.5 national parties, and that needs to be fixed as well. But that's a different show.
And or whoever the biggest donors are.
Exactly. Well, that's who owns the parties. Resolved that the members of the first branch of the national legislature ought to be elected by the people of the several states every blank years for the term of blank to be determined, to be the age of blank will determine it at least. those requirements are already in the Articles of Confederation. They're
now remember, this is the Virginia plan. This is the most populated state in the country saying this is the way things ought to be, and most of it kind of tilts in their direction. Madison wrote this. Remember, I told you Madison came in as a national-minded guy and as a big government guy, and his state having the power type of guy. James Madison turns out to be probably one of our best constitutional presidents of limited government in his future. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Go ahead.
These representatives should receive liberal stipends, payment, by which they may be compensated for the devotion of their time to public service. They should to be ineligible to any office established by a particular state or under the authority of the United States, except those peculiarly, tough word for my tongue, belonging to the functions of the first branch, during the term of service and for the space of blank years.
In other words, no double dipping, man. If you got this office, that's the office you're handling. You're not doing other things at the same time.
Excellent. And this legislature should be incapable of re-election for the space of blank years after the expiration of their term of service, and to be subject to recall. Two huge points there. They wanted term limits.
No, well, they not only wanted term limits, but they also wanted to be able to recall someone easily. And really, what they're talking about here is really both houses. But what wound up happening with the Senate is that subject to recall became very easy. The states appointed the senators, state legislatures, and they could yank them at will. And I remember one time I got into a discussion with a lawyer over this, and he said, "Well, there's no examples of them ever doing that." Actually, there is. One of the most glaring examples was with John Quincy Adams. He had been a member of the Federalist Party, but he kept siding with President Jefferson on a few things, so the Massachusetts legislature yanked him.
Continuing. Resolved that the members of the second branch of the national legislature ought to be elected by those of the first, out of a proper number of persons nominated by the individual legislatures.
In other words, what they're saying is that it wouldn't be the state legislatures per se as much as the legislature voted in by the people.
Yeah. But they said out of the first. That's the Congress, the House of Representatives.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and they select who would be the senators. Obviously,
right. That went south.
Yes, it did. This one gets shot down on the floor. And they said they should be of certain age to hold their offices for a term sufficient to ensure their independency. So they wanted longer terms. To receive liberal stipends, which they get paid, and to be ineligible for any office established, same stuff with the eligibility. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the proposed by Virginia for the House and the Senate now. Next, we have resolved that each branch ought to possess the right of originating acts to basically propose legislation.
Yeah, so both can propose legislation, but go ahead.
That the national legislature ought to be empowered to enjoy the legislative rights vested in Congress by the Confederation, and moreover to legislate all cases to which the separate states are incompetent, meaning they don't have the jurisdiction or authority. Mm-hmm. This is interstate commerce generally. Or in which the harmony of the United States may be interrupted by the exercise of individual legislation. To negative all laws passed by the several states.
Now, this is interesting. This is Madison saying that the national legislature should be able to strike down state law that they didn't like, that they didn't think was quote unquote unconstitutional. His tune changed down the road on that.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you emphasized it, because this is one of the most important arguments we have on constitutional issues: is should there ever have been a federal negative on state laws? And what they'll debate here in Philadelphia and decide is no, there should not.
Right.
Now, that obviously changed with the Judiciary Act of 1789, which gives the courts, the federal courts, much more power than they were ever intended.
Well, it began that process. The courts at that point were not exercising it yet until they, quote unquote, codified it with their own language in Marbury versus Madison through Marshall. We lovingly call that judicial review. The judiciary's job originally through the Constitution is to apply the law, period. Whether they thought the law was constitutional or not, legal or not, valid or not, their job was to apply the law. If they didn't like the law, then they could issue an opinion. To this day, the dockets still end. It is in the opinion of the court, but an opinion is an opinion. It is not legally binding.
So what's really going on here is you have the most populous state, Virginia, proposing that our legislature, our lawmaking body, is based on pure population, which gives them the most say. And that same legislative body will have the ability to negate your own state laws. And
think about states like New Jersey and Delaware. Whoa, hey, you're telling me Virginia is going to basically control what we do in our states?
Yeah,
that's like the cities telling the farmers how to farm.
Sort of like how California and New York can almost control the country now.
Exactly.
And it's not a good mix. And that's what they would debate that and come to the same conclusion eventually. Contravening, or in the opinion of the national legislature, at the Articles of Union, and to call forth the force of the Union against any member of the Union failing to fulfill its duty under the Articles thereof.
So what it's doing is it's calling for a firmer union, something where you're committed to it. I say firmer union than what was under the Articles. I don't say the word firm, because if you say firm union, then that eliminates the voluntary nature of the union. They're looking for a firmer union, but it's still a voluntary union.
Okay. Number 7, it's resolved that a national executive be instituted. Article 2, the President of the United States, the executive branch, to be chosen by the national legislature for a term of who knows how many years, to receive punctually at stated times a fixed compensation in which no increase or diminution shall be made so as to affect the magistracy. Stop right there. Interesting part there is this president would be chosen by the national legislature.
Well, they immediately understood that the head of state should not be democratically voted in. And if he is president of the union, while there is a representation of the people there, he's really representing the Union of States. And that is, as a person, do you want the president nosing into your business? No. So he's not your president as much as he is the union's president. And their attitude is, okay, the representatives of the union then would elect him. But then that was not liked. But we know we don't want a democracy. We got to find something in between. That's where the electors would later come in. And we'll talk about that on another show.
Very good. It's an important point, though. We'll definitely be talking about it more. Existing at the same time of increase or diminution, and to be ineligible a second time. 1 term limit for the president is what they're proposing. Now, the history of that is interesting because, well, we'll get into this more, but Hamilton wanted an elected king to rule for life.
Yeah.
And Washington would then set the great precedent of, well, he ran the second time because to show confidence in the government that there was going to be continuity, and he did not run a third time because he wanted to set the example for the peaceful handover of power.
And that idea of 2 terms, even though it was not codified in the Constitution at that point yet, that would be later with the 22nd Amendment. Because he set that example, and he's the quote unquote father of the country. Only 2 individuals before Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to reach a third term after that. That would be Grant and Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, when he ran as the Bull Moose Party, quote unquote, progressive party candidate, when Taft and Wilson, and that's a whole different story. Folks, shenanigans have been going on all along.
Politics is a dirty game.
Yeah.
Always has been, always will be. And that's why government must be limited, because you get power-hungry people trying to get in those positions. That's what it attracts. Yeah. All right, continuing. And that besides a general authority to execute the national laws, it ought to enjoy the executive rights vested in Congress by the Confederation.
Vested is an important word there. This is a word that they've been using all along. It's in the Constitution at the beginning of each of the three articles that establishes the three branches. Vested is a term that echoes A, Montesquieu's call for a separation of power, and B, recognizes that those powers are not only separate from each branch, but they can't just give them away. They're irrevocable, unless, of course, there's an amendment to the Constitution. And so, for example, Congress is not supposed to be able to just legislate away their power, like they did with the Federal Reserve Act when they legislated their power to coin money. But never mind. I digress.
Funny, that was the example I was thinking of too. And the Fed. But we've already done that show.
Yeah, vested is an important word. So anytime you guys see vested in these documents, understand that means exclusionary and irrevocable. It's exclusionary to that branch, and it's irrevocable. They can't just give it away.
I also like the fact that Madison capitalized executive rights.
Mm-hmm.
That's
an emphasis.
Yeah. Now you have to use all caps to get emphasis.
And then people say, why are you shouting at me? Anyway, go ahead.
Resolve that the executive and a convenient number of the national judiciary ought to compose a council of revision with authority to examine every act of the national legislature before it shall operate.
Stop.
Full stop.
You heard my ears perking up.
Oh, yeah.
That's judicial review. They debated judicial review. And you know what? That got shot down.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get into those debates. So this is a big one. It's one of the most important constitutional topics there is. We're hitting a lot of the important things that I guess we'll probably get all of them. Yeah. That's why this is such a great exercise. We're getting into the heads of the original, what is the original intent of this document, not how it's been interpreted by unelected judges. And every act of a particular legislature before a negative thereon shall be final. And
pretty harsh.
And that the dissent of the said council shall amount to a rejection, unless the act of the national legislature be again passed, or that of a particular legislature be again negatived by a certain amount of numbers of the members of each branch.
Now, remember, this is James Madison's pen. While it's being presented by Randolph and it's being presented by Virginia, this was penned by James Madison. He spent 9 months working on this thing from the Annapolis Convention in August of 1786 until May of 1787. And this is a guy that Alexander Hamilton, and today's progressives would be proud of. But as president of the United States, and as he became greater friends with Jefferson, and Madison understand during this convention are communicating by letter. Jefferson is in France. Granted, it's taken a couple of months for the letters to arrive, but once again, you watch this transformation of Madison. And the reason why I bring this up is when I get, and I want you really to understand this, folks. When I get into debates with certain people and they say, well, Madison said, well, you have to take into the context of when he said it. If he said it prior to about the midway point of the Constitutional Convention, that is not the man he became. That was the old Madison who believed in a strong national government. And the nice thing is, as human beings, we do change, we do grow, we do sometimes come to our senses. So the next time someone says, well, when this politician was in his 20s, is he the man today that he was then? Madison, as president, as member of the House of Representatives in the first Congress, was not the man he is when he wrote this.
The other interesting thing about this paragraph is he said they are proposing that the executive, meaning the President of the United States, and a convenient number of the judiciary are the ones having oversight of legislature. What they would end up compromising on is that they got the president out of that and gave him a veto power that could be overturned. And that's what the last second part of this paragraph is. How do you can you overrule a veto with enough people?
You know, they wanted the three branches to be independent, separation of powers, yet work together. You got to find the balance. And that was the key there. Balance. I talked about this a couple weeks ago on my Mr. Constitution Hour program, which you can find on podcasts and San Diego stations, radio. But it was all about balance. They knew this extreme was bad. They knew that extreme was bad. But how do you create a balance? We don't want the executive to have too much power. We don't want the legislative to have too much power. We want them to be able to check each other, but we don't want the check to be so severe that they can't operate.
Very good. We've got we got to get through 15 of these resolutions. I think we can do that in the next 30 minutes. Do you have time for that?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Good. Bear with me. Okay. Resolved that a national judiciary be established to consist of one or more supreme tribunals and of inferior tribunals to be chosen by the legislature.
That stayed. Go ahead.
Yeah. They didn't, Articles of Confederation, we did not have a federal court system. You commit a crime in Maryland, you get tried in Maryland.
And there were those that argued during the convention not to have a federal judiciary, but the argument became, well, what about disputes across state lines? What about maritime disputes and so on and so forth? So,
to hold their offices during good behavior, which is something that we've talked about. How is that defined? And to receive punctually at stated times fixed compensation for their services, no increase or diminution, blah, blah, blah.
Because we didn't want the legislature going, hey, roll a certain way and you get a raise, or vice versa. If you don't rule the way we want, you're losing money.
Okay, now we're going to talk about the jurisdiction. Why did these courts get created? They're going to articulate it for you right now.
Okay.
Such as jurisdiction of the inferior tribunals shall be to hear and determine in the first instance, and of the supreme tribunal to hear and determine in the dernier resort, all piracies and felonies on the high seas, captures from an enemy, cases in which foreigners or citizens of other states applying to such jurisdictions may be interested, or which respect the collection of the national revenue. Stopping right there. They're also going to go on impeachments of national officers and questions which may involve the national harmony.
Please note that the Supreme, in other words, the Supreme Court, on these cases would have appellate jurisdiction. The inferior courts would be the first court. The Supreme Court would be the final, but the appellate authority. Go ahead.
Yeah, what's also interesting here, what's not included here, and you'd also see it not included in Article 3 when the Constitution gets ratified, is any jurisdiction over purely in-state issues. There was no federal negative from the court system.
No.
You didn't
even at this point when they wanted to negative state constitutions.
Yeah. That's a really important point. We're going to hammer it home over and over because we have a tyrannical judiciary right now that is ruling on everything under the sun. And you know, it's been corrupted. And
yeah,
when the left can't get what they want legislatively, they use the courts to do it instead.
And that goes all the way back to the beginning of time. We saw with the midnight judges. That's exactly what the Federalist Party, the big government Federalist Party, did. Exact same thing. Retreated to the stronghold of the courts, where it'd be more difficult to dislodge them. Continue.
And that's something that was absolutely not intended by this resolution. Resolved that provision ought to be made for the admission of states lawfully arising within the limits of the United States, whether from a voluntary junction of government and territory or otherwise with the consent of a number of voices in the national legislature less than a whole. How do we add?
In other words, a majority, not 100% unanimous.
Yeah, this Congress will determine what that number needs to be. Point being, we can add to our territory if other territories meet certain standards and Congress approves. 11, it is resolved that a Republican government in the territory of each state, except in the instance of a voluntary junction of government and territory, ought to be guaranteed by the United States to each state. Article 4, Section 4.
Article 4, Section 4. Absolutely. This is important. Notice it doesn't say resolve that a democracy. It says a Republican government. What they mean by that is not a democracy. That doesn't mean that democracy isn't important. The House of Representatives was created with that. But it is a requirement of the federal government to ensure that that Republican form of government remains. One of the aspects of the Republican form of government, and we mentioned this earlier, was this two chambers of a legislature, and those two chambers being different from each other. In other words, one might be democratically voted in, another one would be put in place differently. One of them might have the number of seats determined by population. The other one would be a set amount regardless of population. Our state Senate used to be at the state level that they were not voted in. They were appointed by the county legislature, and it was one per county rather than by population. Reynolds v. Sims, 1964, changed that as some of the states began to change the way they did it because of the 17th Amendment.
And if you go back on my channel, Doug and I have done shows on both the 17th Amendment and Reynolds v. Sims. Those was just probably about 3-4 months ago we did those. So those are you get a lot. We go into a lot of detail about that. Yeah. And again, it's this whole argument of protecting the small from the large and the large from the small.
About 4 or 5 weeks ago, I did an episode on Mr. Constitution Hour. Once again, you can find Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs on any of the podcast channels. Just enter that into the search bar. And because a friend of mine told me, because she has met with President Trump like 6 times, and I was talking about the 17th Amendment, Reynolds v. Sims, and due process at a particular event that I hosted at the Independence Hall there at Knott's Berry Farm. It's a replica of the one in Philadelphia. And she says, well, have you told Donald Trump about this? I said, well, I don't exactly. I'm not exactly in his ear, but she says, well, I've met with him 6 times. I'll get it to him. So this is about, 5 weeks ago. And the episode is titled, I believe, Due Process and Preserving the Republic, or What a Republic Is, or something like that. And I spend the entire show talking about due process. Now, due process based on the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the Article 4 is for citizens. We don't have to give it to non-citizens. And then the other being what we just talked about, 17th Amendment, Reynolds v. Sims. She has sent him that link.
Excellent. Resolve.
And check it out yourself, because if you're like, well, gosh, I wish I knew more about that. I talk about this kind of stuff on those shows. Go ahead.
Resolved that provision ought to be made for the continuance of Congress and their authorities and privileges until a given day after the reform of the Articles of Union shall be adopted, and for the completion of all their engagements. What are they saying here?
So go ahead.
No, go for it.
All right. So, in other words, what they're saying is that the Congress will continue, regardless of the change, until the change happens. They will be able to complete what they started. It's sort of like in Article 6, where it basically says that all of our treaties and all of our agreements are going to transfer to the new Congress, or to the new government, should I say. It's not saying the old Congress just suddenly now no longer matters and the new one matters. It's saying, well, let the old Congress finish what it's doing, and then everything it did that ties into our American system will transfer over. While we are changing governments, it is not a different country, and we're still going to honor our commitments. The authorities and privileges that have been established are going to continue. So we're going to allow them to complete all of the engagements they are in the process of.
Excellent. 13, resolve that provision ought to be made for the amendments of the Articles of Union whensoever it shall seem necessary, and that the assent of the national legislature legislature ought not to be required thereto.
That's just continuance of the last one, but basically, what it's saying is, if we amend the Articles of the Union, the Confederation, that once again, this national legislature is going to, nothing's going to change. This, let me rephrase this. 12 and 13 are saying we are creating something new, but it's the same. It's almost a reassurance. We're not writing a new constitution.
That's exactly what it is.
We're just fixing. And so Congress isn't going to change. I mean, there's going to be some changes, but don't worry. Their privileges, immunities, and the authorities and their engagements, that's all the same. We're just doing some tweaks. Don't worry. That's essentially what those two are saying.
Excellent. 14, resolved that the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers within the several states ought to be bound by oath to support the Articles of Union. The oath to the Constitution came from that.
To preserve and protect, brother. Not that these people know what that means, but that's beside the point.
Resolved that the amendments which shall be offered to the Confederation by the Convention ought at a proper time or times after the approbation of Congress to be submitted to an assembly or assemblies of representatives recommended by the several legislatures to be expressly chosen by the people and to consider and decide thereon.
Once again, we're not talking about a new constitution. We're amending the Articles of Confederation, and it's saying, hey, these amendments, it doesn't stop here. Still needs to go out there. Still needs to be approved by people who represent the voice of the people. Well, we're not just suddenly changing the government without permission. It's still got to go out there. That's all it's saying.
And he's also saying it needs to be done by convention rather than like a popular vote.
Right.
That's really important. We need more conventions of the proper kind.
Yeah.
Okay. He concluded with an exhortation not to suffer the present opportunity of establishing general peace, harmony, happiness, and liberty in the U.S. to pass away unimproved. So this is our opportunity, guys. Let's fix it. It was then resolved that the House will tomorrow resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the state of the American Union, and that the propositions moved by Mr. Randolph be referred to the said committee. It was then resolved that the House will tomorrow resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the state of the American Union, and that the propositions moved by Mr. Randolph be referred to the said committee. And that's a good place to cut off.
And I want folks to understand something about these episodes as we work through this. While I have gone through Madison's notes a number of times in my life, I am purposely not trying to study up before we have these episodes. I want to be looking at them kind of through the eyes of the founders because this was new to them and from what they knew and what they saw. So when I give the commentary, understand this is not something that I rehearsed ahead of time. This is something that I'm recognizing, I'm seeing, and then we're talking about it because I want us to understand that the founding fathers, this was their first time, but also because I want to come across as spontaneous as possible. I don't want to sound rehearsed, but that said, and please don't take it wrong. I'm not like patting myself on the back. I'd hurt my shoulder if I did that. But I do want to explain to you that if you know history and if you've got to know the founding fathers, this really isn't actually as hard as some of us think to understand. I remember when I was teaching classes, people said, "What's so complex?" It's complex because the establishment has made it complex. Put yourself into the shoes of the founding fathers. Read up on who they were, what they're about, and then go through this with us. And you'll start seeing things. It's almost like putting on a new set of glasses and saying, whoa, now I see it clearly. This is why being informed and understanding our founding fathers, the good and their flaws, is so important.
Well said. That was a fun episode. We're going to get to some counter proposals here in the near future. But
I can't wait until we get to the New Jersey plan. But even more fun is when Roger Sherman starts saying, "Whoa, guys, hey!" So that's a lot of fun. But Connecticut compromise.
And Madison captures the language pretty well in most cases.
Yes.
So it's going to get pretty entertaining. And like Doug says, they fought like cats and dogs. the founding fathers did.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so it gets spicy. You need to use your imagination because to really understand how heated it was. And that heated in more than one ways because they're in this convention hall in Philadelphia in the middle of the summer wearing wool clothes, and it's 100 degrees outside. So yeah,
Humidity.
Yeah, that was a good episode. Doug, once again, tell everyone where they can find you.
DouglasVGibbs.com. That should give you the way to anywhere to go, but also recognize that I do have 2 radio programs. And when I say radio, I don't just mean something online. I am actually on terrestrial radio, KMET 1490 AM in Riverside County on Saturdays. I used to say from 1 to 3. I just negotiated a new contract. We're dropping an hour because we just don't have the funding we used to have. So it's going to be 1 to 2 until further notice. So my new contract is 1 to 2 Pacific time with Alan Myers and Dennis Jackson as my co-hosts. And then the Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V Gibbs on 2 San Diego stations. That's 8 p.m. Pacific on Saturdays. And you can check that out at kcbq.com or kprz.com at that time, or later on pretty much any of the podcast platforms. Just type in Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V Gibbs. But really, don't forget douglasvgibbs.com, douglasvgibbs.com. And I've got some new articles there. And I think some of you will appreciate what I've been writing there because I've been tackling some interesting subjects, to say the least. The Los Angeles ICE riots, the Trump derangement syndrome, but my favorite, unconstitutionality of birthright citizenship explained. Check it out.
Yeah, we've done a couple shows on that as well. Now, it's funny you mentioned the radio. I was a guest yesterday on Zaki Radio. That's the radio show of California gubernatorial candidate Leo Zaki, who I've known for a number of years. And he had me on there to discuss the interesting financing of these LA riots. And with the help of other sleuths on the internet, we've discovered an awful lot of shenanigans going on. And I'll have that show up on my channel later today.
It really is an invasion.
I'll have that show up my channel later today. I tried to put it up this morning, but somehow I only got half the video up there, so I had to delete it, and I'll be putting it back up. I'll put it back up after this show. But you're going to want to check that out. It's good stuff.
Very good.
Doug, always a pleasure, my friend. Cheers, everyone. This will be regular from now on. We'll get at least one of these episodes in a week. So
now that I'm back home again,
yeah, we'll start picking up the pace. Sometimes we'll be able to do two in a week. So, all right, everybody. Cheers.